Some storms don't roar, they just walk in quietly and rearrange the room. No one recognized the old man in the leather jacket when he stepped into the rusted spur. No one cared when he sat in the one chair no one dared touch. But by the time he walked out, every man inside realized they hadn't just picked the wrong fight, they'd misjudged what strength really looks like. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if you believe silence can speak louder than fists, don't forget to subscribe. The wind outside howled across the Arizona flatlands like a warning no one would hear. Dust swirled beneath the glowing neon sign of the rusted spur, a weather-beaten bar where the leather was older than the men who wore it, and the jukebox hadn't played anything soft since 1987. Inside, it smelled like diesel, smoke, and stories no one dared retell. The door creaked open, just one sound, but somehow it made the 8 men at the center table glance up, briefly. Then came the assumption, the shrug, the dismissal. Nothing to worry about, just an old man. He didn't wear a patch, no colors, no steel on his belt, no chrome on his boots. Just a worn leather jacket, jeans faded at the knees, boots scuffed from real ground, not showroom floors. The kind of man who looked like he'd walked farther than most had ridden. A battered fedora cast a shadow over his eyes, and he walked like the wind behind him owed him something. The stranger stepped into the bar and paused, not from hesitation, but as if listening to a room no one else could hear. Then he moved, slowly, deliberately, past the pool table, past the bartender who froze with a rag in mid-wipe, and past the group of bikers at the center of the bar who had now turned just enough to feel superior. They didn't know the man, but they knew that chair, the one by the front window, the one no one sat in, not since Griggs SR died 6 years ago in a bar brawl 3 counties over. That seat was his, and then it was no one's. Like a shrine made of wood and dust, a reminder of who built the bar's reputation with blood, bruises, and bourbon. Everyone knew it, everyone but the man in the fedora. He walked to it like it was just another chair, sat down like it was just another day, ordered a bourbon neat and didn't look back. The room changed, not loudly, not obviously, but like a storm gathering under skin. One biker at the center table let out a short chuckle, too loud for the joke. Another scratched his beard and glanced sideways. It wasn't what the old man had done. It was what he hadn't done. No glance around, no ask, no deference. He just sat that seat. Griggs Jr., the man now sitting where his father used to hold court, leaned forward. His boots creaked, his jaw tensed, but he didn't say anything, not yet. Maybe the guy was just passing through. Maybe he didn't know, but maybe he did. That was worse. The bartender looked down, suddenly busy with taps that didn't need cleaning. Even the jukebox skipped for a second, as if the room itself was uncertain what came next. Outside, the wind blew harder, whistling against the single-pane windows like a breath held too long. Inside, 8 men watched an old man sit in the wrong chair like he was born for it. And he just stared out the window, like the world beyond the glass still had something worth waiting for. No one said a word, but the room had already made up its mind. They didn't know who he was, not yet. But they knew one thing, he didn't belong. Not in that seat, not in that story. What they didn't realize was that stories don't ask for permission. Sometimes they just walk through the door, dust on their boots and quiet in their bones. The room didn't speak, but it breathed. Heavier now, thicker, like the air had turned to oil. At the center table, Griggs Jr. leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, eyes locked on the man by the window. His fingers, wrapped in rings thick as knuckles, drummed a slow rhythm against the table. One ring bore the symbol of a skull, another just the letter G, his father's initial, his father's chair. And some dusty stranger had just sat in it like he didn't know, or worse, like he didn't care. Griggs didn't need to say anything. His crew read the silence like scripture. Diesel stood first. 6'5", built like a wrecking ball left too long in the sun. Beard down to his collarbone, vest torn across the shoulder, boots the size of toolboxes. He didn't snarl, didn't even smirk. Just grabbed a pint of beer and made his way toward the window seat, slow and deliberate, the way a man walks when he's about to make someone else small. The others shifted in their chairs, casual but alert, like dogs waiting for a cue. Harrison didn't move, didn't glance. He just sat there, elbow on the table, fingers loose around a glass of bourbon that hadn't yet been touched. His eyes were on the horizon through the dirty window, watching something no one else could see. Diesel passed close behind him, then pivoted fast. A lazy stumble, a too-wide swing of the arm, and then it happened. The splash. Cold beer poured across Harrison's forearm, soaking the sleeve of his weathered jacket, running down his hand and dripping onto his lap. The glass in Diesel's hand tilted, a mock expression of surprise plastered across his face. "Well, hell," he said, not sounding sorry. "Look at that. These old hands of mine, clumsy today." The bar chuckled, but it wasn't humor. It was ritual, a sound they all knew how to make. Harrison looked down, no flinch, no curse, just a pause, like his body asked permission before reacting. Then he set his glass down slowly, reached across the table for a napkin, and dabbed the sleeve dry with calm, methodical movements. His fingers moved like a craftsman, patient, practiced, unbothered. Diesel hovered nearby, waiting for something, anything. A flinch, a rise, a reason. He got none. Harrison wiped the rim of the table with the same napkin, folded it once, and set it aside. Then he picked up the bourbon and took a sip. Slow, clean, eyes still on the window. Diesel turned back to the group, muttering, "Guy ain't even real," and sat down. The room shifted again, not louder, not quieter, just unsettled. Like someone had knocked a painting off kilter and no one wanted to fix it. Griggs finally leaned forward, resting both forearms on the table, eyes narrowing. "Hey," he said, voice carrying just enough to cut through the music. "Look who thinks he's Indiana Jones." Laughter followed, not funny, just obedient. Harrison didn't move. Cole did, the youngest of the crew, barely out of his 20s, no tattoos yet, still wore gloves on rides to keep the calluses away. He sat in the far corner, a half-empty beer in hand, eyes fixed on the old man. Something about the way he moved, or didn't, tugged at something vague in his memory. The quiet, the poise, the profile under that beat-up fedora. He'd seen it before, somewhere, but where? Griggs wasn't done. He chuckled louder now. "Bet he's got a whip in that coat, maybe a golden idol in his back pocket." More laughter. Diesel leaned in. What if he's just lost? Old man probably thought this was bingo night. A few others howled. One slapped the table. Another barked like a dog. Harrison took another sip. No smile, no frown, just presence. That kind of stillness that makes people start talking louder just to hear themselves. Griggs watched him closely now. The laughter behind him faded, replaced by a tension none of them could name. "You know what I hate," he said, voice lower now, "when people walk into a place they don't belong and act like it's theirs." That got a few nods. One man cracked his knuckles, another adjusted his vest. But Cole, he stayed silent, that face, that calm. His eyes drifted to his phone. An old news photo popped into his head. A charity auction in Texas. Smiling man, leather jacket, same jawline, same stillness. It couldn't be, could it? Across the room, the wind pushed harder against the windows. Harrison set his glass down again. Then he looked, for the first time, at Griggs. A glance, just one, but it landed like a stone in a still pond. No words, not yet. But the shift had started, and everyone felt it, even the ones pretending not to. The jukebox gave out with a sudden hiccup, like it had lost interest in playing to a room that forgot how to listen. The last note of an old rock ballad wavered, then fell silent. No one touched it again. No one said a word. The silence wasn't peace. It was pressure, thick, stretched thin, waiting to snap. Griggs stood, not fast, not theatrical, just slow enough for every bootstep to echo louder than it needed to. He walked toward the window seat, fingers tapping against his belt buckle like a fuse being lit. Harrison sat still, not flinching, not blinking. His hand rested lightly on the rim of his bourbon glass, the other on the table, fingers spread as if feeling the grain of the wood beneath him. Griggs stopped beside the table and stared down. No hello, no insult, just an action, one sharp, deliberate swipe. The fedora flew off the table and landed on the floor beside Harrison's boot. The room inhaled collectively. Harrison looked at it for a long second, then bent down, not rushed, not stiff, just natural, as if nothing about this moment surprised him. He picked up the hat with one hand, shook off the dust from the floor, and brushed it with the side of his thumb. Then slowly he stood. It wasn't a challenge, it wasn't a threat. It was a man rising because something needed to be looked at straight. He stood tall, but not towering, just steady. And then he looked Griggs in the eye. It was the first time they locked gazes. The room stilled even further. One man shifted in his seat, his boots squeaked and got shushed. Harrison tilted his head just slightly, enough to break the weight in the air, and then his voice came. Low. Even, son, the loudest ones in the room usually carry the least weight. It didn't hit like a punch. It didn't need to. It landed like winter. Cold, certain, and uninvited. Griggs blinked, just once, but it was enough. Enough for the men behind him to notice. The corners of a few mouths tightened. One man looked away. Another leaned back slightly, instinctively, the kind of small shifts that said everything without saying a thing. Griggs let out a dry laugh, short and empty. "You got jokes, old man," he said. "You think that's clever?" Harrison didn't answer. He just looked, not through him, at him, present, undisturbed. That silence stretched again, tighter this time. Like it might crack, and when it did, it wouldn't make noise, it would change the room. Griggs straightened his shoulders, trying to fill the air again. "You don't know where you're standing," he said. "You don't know who you're talking to." Harrison didn't move. He didn't blink. He simply replied, "I know enough to know you're trying too hard to prove something." Griggs's hand twitched, not enough for action, just enough to betray the storm under his skin. He wasn't used to this. Most men barked or backed down. This one did neither, and that made him dangerous. The rest of the bar watched with the kind of focus usually reserved for watching flames grow. Cole sat forward in his chair, eyes fixed on the old man. Something in his chest shifted. Recognition, maybe, or the beginning of it. Diesel cracked his knuckles, ready to move, but Griggs held up a hand. Not yet. He didn't want backup. Not for this. This had become personal. The man in the leather jacket and fedora had drawn a line, not with fists, not with threats, but with calm. And now, everyone waited to see who would cross it first. Harrison adjusted the hat in his hand, not putting it on yet. He didn't need to. The message had already been delivered. Griggs stepped back half a step, just a breath of space, enough to show he hadn't planned what came next. The air didn't loosen, it thickened, and outside the wind pressed against the glass with more urgency, like it was trying to get inside before something happened. Harrison sat down again, same seat, same posture, same silence. But now the room had changed, and Griggs knew it. For the first time all night, he wasn't sure who had the power, and that uncertainty, that silence, it was deafening. The wind howled harder now, pushing dust against the windows like a fistful of gravel scraping glass. The neon sign outside flickered once, then held steady, casting a red glow across the warped wood floor like a warning light no one wanted to admit they saw. Inside, the bar held its breath. No one spoke. No one moved. Griggs stood there, jaw tight, chest rising just a little too fast. Across from him, Harrison sat calm as stone, hands resting on the table, the fedora now balanced gently on his lap. That look in his eyes, it wasn't defiance. It wasn't fear, it was stillness. And for a man like Griggs, stillness was the loudest threat, the kind that didn't flinch, didn't bark, didn't break, just stood there holding a mirror. And Griggs didn't like what he saw. His boot moved first, quick, angry, deliberate. He kicked the leg of Harrison's chair with a crack. The whole seat jerked, sliding an inch across the floor. The bourbon glass tipped over and splashed across the table, dripping down the edge like blood from a slow cut. Still, Harrison didn't react. He moved only to steady himself with one hand on the edge of the table, then leaned back slowly, calmly, folding the soaked napkin and setting it to the side. Griggs's breath caught. He had expected a reaction, wanted it, needed it, but this silence, it swallowed him. Harrison looked up at him then, eyes clear, voice low. "You're not angry at me, you're angry at the silence no one fears." The words didn't echo, they didn't need to. They just stayed in the air, floating, impossible to avoid. A few men shifted in their seats. Diesel looked away. Even the bartender paused mid-pour, frozen in place. Griggs didn't respond. Not right away, because for the first time that night, he didn't have a script. His anger didn't feel sharp anymore. It felt exposed. He clenched his fists, but the weight in the room pressed back harder. From the far side of the room, Cole watched it unfold. His beer sat untouched on the table, condensation sliding down the side in slow trails. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and opened the photo he had pulled up earlier. It was grainy, taken years ago at a charity auction somewhere in Texas, but the face was unmistakable. Same lines, same eyes, same quiet power that didn't ask to be noticed but couldn't be ignored. He glanced from the screen to the man at the window. Same jaw, same calm. He zoomed in, just to be sure. It was him, Harrison Ford, Indiana Jones, Han Solo, the guy from 100 movies and 1,000 stories. But more than that, the man who'd just been insulted, soaked, and kicked without once raising his voice. Cole looked around the bar. No one else had noticed. Not yet. They were too busy watching the tension unfold like a fuse burning slow. Griggs took a breath, trying to find ground he thought was his, but it was already gone. Harrison had never moved to claim it. He had just never given it up. Outside, the wind slammed against the building again, louder this time, like the storm was knocking. Inside, the storm had already arrived, but it wasn't the kind that shattered windows. It was the kind that stared you down and made you realize you weren't built to face it. Not really. Harrison remained seated, bourbon dripping off the table edge, coat damp, gaze steady. Griggs stood there, fists clenched, ego cracking. And in that silence, something shifted. Not in Harrison, in everyone else. The door burst open with a snap, and the wind came in like it had something to say. Cold air swept through the bar, grabbing at napkins and loose bills, rattling glasses just enough to remind everyone the outside world still existed. Heads turned, slowly, not like curiosity, like instinct, the kind that made your spine tighten before your brain caught up. And there he was, Chuck Norris, no introduction, no dramatic entrance music. Just denim dust, and that calm weight of presence that filled the room like smoke from a lit match. He didn't look left or right, didn't scan for threats. His eyes locked on the man by the window, on Harrison. His boots echoed once, then again. Measured, heavy, the kind of steps that didn't ask for attention, they took it. The bikers froze. Griggs didn't move. His fists, still clenched at his sides, loosened just slightly. Diesel stopped halfway out of his seat. Cole's phone dropped silently onto his table, the screen still lit with Harrison's photo. Chuck walked through the bar like a man who had done this before. Not here, but places like this. Places where testosterone boiled over and pride turned men into fools. He stepped right up to Harrison's table. Harrison didn't rise. He just looked up, calm as ever. A small smirk tugged at the edge of his mouth. Chuck put a hand on his shoulder and said, "You still picked the wrong bars on purpose." Harrison lifted his bourbon glass, what was left of it anyway, and replied, "Keeps life interesting." A ripple moved through the room. Not laughter. Not relief, just exhale, like everyone had been holding their breath since he walked in. Chuck turned, his eyes sweeping across the bar, not fast, just enough to let every man in the room know he'd seen them, all of them. When his gaze landed on Griggs, it didn't stay long, but it didn't need to. Griggs stiffened like someone had pointed a rifle at his pride. Chuck looked back at Harrison. His voice was quieter now. A tone only meant for the two of them, but the room heard it anyway. Why let it go this far? Harrison's eyes didn't shift. He took another sip, then said, "Sometimes people need to walk into their own reflection." Chuck nodded slowly, like he already knew the answer but needed to hear it out loud. "You gave them a choice," he said, "and they chose wrong." Harrison set his glass down gently. Most people do when no one's watching. A silence settled again, but this one was different. It wasn't the sharp silence of tension. It was the heavy silence of realization. A few bikers looked down. Others shifted uncomfortably. Cole was still staring, but now not at Harrison. At Chuck, because now the room understood. The man they mocked had been calm, but the man standing next to him had come for closure. Chuck turned back to Griggs. He didn't move toward him, didn't threaten, just looked, and said, "You picked the wrong man to test." Griggs's mouth opened, then closed. Nothing came out. Chuck kept going. "You're lucky, he's the patient one." The words didn't shout, they didn't punch. They landed with the kind of weight only truth carries. Griggs looked at Diesel, as if searching for backup that wasn't coming. The rest of the crew suddenly looked very small and very alone. Chuck glanced around the room one last time, not checking, not counting, just making sure the silence stayed where it was. Then he looked at Harrison again. "You ready?" Harrison stood, no flourish, no sound of chairs scraping, just one man rising, not taller, just heavier now, not in size, in presence. In memory, he grabbed his fedora, settled it on his head, and nodded. "Let's go." Together, the two of them turned, no rush, no fear, no need to look back. But as they walked toward the door, the crowd didn't part out of fear. They parted out of understanding, because what had just happened wasn't a rescue, it was a warning. And everyone knew it was Chuck's boots that made them nervous. It was the man who never raised a hand and still made them feel small. The door was almost within reach when it happened. That one voice, sharp and cracked with pride, rose above the silence like a nail scraping glass. "Griggs, you think walking out makes you right?" he barked. "You think we're just supposed to sit here and feel small?" His boots thundered against the floor as he stormed forward. There was no plan in his steps, no tactic, just noise, muscle, and the kind of rage that comes from being seen too clearly. Chuck stopped, didn't even turn at first, just breathed, then slowly pivoted, one foot planting with the calm of someone who'd already decided how this ended. Griggs was already charging, fists clenched, eyes wild. And that's what made it easy. He was too loud, too obvious, too full of the need to win a fight that wasn't even his. Chuck took one step forward, just one, and as Griggs swung with a wild right hook, Chuck didn't dodge, he didn't flinch. He stepped in, a slight pivot, a turn of the hip, and then crack. Chuck's boot hit square in the center of Griggs's chest, not flashy, not dramatic, but clean, efficient, precise. The sound it made wasn't loud, but it was final. Griggs flew backward, legs folding under him as he collided with his own table. Glasses shattered, chairs tipped over. A gasp rippled through the room as the body hit the floor, hard, unmoving. A second passed, then another. No one rushed in. No one helped. Chuck didn't move, just stood there, boots still planted, breath steady. The weight of what had happened settled over the room like dust after a collapse. Harrison didn't blink, he just watched. And maybe, just maybe, there was a flicker of something behind his eyes. Not satisfaction, not relief, just confirmation that this was always going to happen, that some men only learn through force when they refuse to hear anything else. Chuck looked around the room, slow and deliberate. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. "He let you walk all over him," he said, "and still walked out taller than you." The silence after that wasn't just quiet, it was ashamed. The kind that creeps into a man's chest when he realizes the person he mocked had already surpassed him in every way. Cole sat frozen, phone forgotten, eyes locked on the figure standing in the middle of the bar like the last honest man in a town that forgot what integrity looked like. Behind the bar, the bartender finally set down the glass he'd been drying for too long. His jaw clenched, his hands trembled, and still no one moved to help Griggs, because in that moment no one dared. Chuck turned back to Harrison. "Anything else you need?" Harrison adjusted his jacket, took a breath that sounded like it had been waiting years to be exhaled, and shook his head. "Lesson landed," he said. Chuck nodded once, not to Harrison, to the room. As if to say, remember this. Not the kick, not the crash. Remember the silence before it. That's where the power was. And as they turned again toward the door, the bar stayed still, because some moments don't end with applause. They end with reckoning. Griggs didn't move. Just a heap of leather, sweat, and ego crumpled beneath the broken leg of his own table. The rest of the bar sat frozen, as if breathing might draw attention. Chuck and Harrison were already at the door, the cold air curling in behind them like a punctuation mark. But the real storm wasn't outside. It was settling now, heavy and thick, inside the walls of the rusted spur. Cole stared at his phone again. He didn't need to, he already knew. The photo from that charity auction in Texas. The face, the same quiet eyes, the same jaw, the same posture that didn't need to speak louder to be heard. He turned the screen outward, showing the others nearby. A few leaned in, eyes widened. One man muttered a curse under his breath. Another just shook his head. They had no idea who they'd mocked, who they'd spilled beer on. who they tried to break with words and boots and swagger. The bartender exhaled hard, like something had punched the guilt out of his chest. He looked down at the empty bourbon glass on the table, then to the stained napkin folded neatly beside it. "I served Indiana Jones warm bourbon," he muttered, and watched him get spit on. No one answered. What was there to say? A woman near the back, who had kept her distance all night, stepped forward slightly, lips pressed tight. One of the bikers stood, rubbing the back of his neck. Diesel stayed seated, eyes down, suddenly smaller than his size allowed. Griggs groaned quietly on the floor, still dazed, but no one moved to help him. Because no one wanted to stand next to a man who just got humbled by the kind of strength that didn't need fists to show up. The silence was no longer tense, it was reflective. It sat heavy on their backs like dust they hadn't noticed until the light hit just right. Cole looked again at the photo, then to the empty chair, then back. The connection wasn't just confirmed, it was burned in. That man had walked in with nothing but quiet, and walked out having shattered the illusion that power came from volume, from weight, from presence. It came from restraint, from dignity, from knowing who you are even when no one else does. One of the older bikers in the corner leaned forward, voice low, almost like a confession. Maybe he came to show us how small we'd become. No one disagreed. They just kept looking at the chair, empty now. But somehow more important than it ever had been when it belonged to Griggs's father. It wasn't a throne anymore. It was a lesson, and no one dared sit in it. The night outside the rusted spur felt different now. The wind had calmed, like even the desert needed a moment to reflect. Gravel crunched beneath boots as Harrison and Chuck walked side by side across the lot, their shadows long under the flickering porch light. No words for a while, just the sound of the world remembering how to be quiet again. Chuck reached the old pickup first, faded blue, a few dents, nothing fancy, the kind of truck that didn't care what anyone thought. He opened the door, then paused, looked over his shoulder at Harrison. "You didn't need me in there," he said. Harrison looked back at the bar, just a glance. The windows glowed faint, blurred by years of dust and memory. "Maybe not," he said, "but they did." Chuck nodded. "Still didn't throw a punch," he said, climbing in. Harrison walked around to the passenger side, opened the door slowly. "Sometimes," he said, "stillness leaves a bigger bruise." The truck door shut with a soft thud. The engine coughed once, then caught. As they pulled away, the red neon sign flickered behind them, casting its glow over the silent building like a final reminder. Inside, the bar remained frozen. Not by fear, by thought, the kind that hangs heavy and doesn't fade easy. The chair by the window sat empty, still marked with a faint stain of spilled bourbon, still perfectly in place. The bartender stood behind the bar, towel in hand, eyes fixed on that spot. After a long moment, he stepped out, crossed the room without a word, and placed a fresh glass of bourbon on the table. Just one, neat, no garnish. No words. He looked at the chair, nodded once to no one in particular, and whispered just loud enough for the silence to carry it. "If he ever returns, no one sits until he does." He turned, walked back behind the bar, and said nothing more. And in that moment, the entire room understood. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't about movies. It wasn't even about the chair. It was about presence. The kind that didn't demand respect. It just stood there, waited, and let everyone else decide who they really were. Harrison Ford had come in as a stranger, quiet, ordinary. He left as a mirror. And some reflections, once seen, are never forgotten. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.